The 55mm focal length is a great all-around focal length. It actually used to be my favorite because it's so similar to how I see. Some people say they see in 35, but 55mm feels just so natural to me. When I was first starting out in photography, I wanted to capture what I could see. As I got better, I learned I can capture much more than what I'm seeing. But sometimes I still want to be able to translate what's in front of me in a true way. 55mm lenses are great for beginners because they're simple. It's a simple mid-range focal length where you can't mess up much between the distortion of wide angles or camera shake of a telephoto lens. And since it's a simple focal length, you can generally find an affordable 55mm lens of decent quality. In this video, I'm going to talk about why the 55mm lens is a great value, touch on the 50 versus 55 focal lengths, and I'll share some specific examples of when I use this lens. I'm Brenda Bergreen, giving you practical photography advice to complement Mark's gear reviews from our real-world experience as a husband and wife photo video team. Hit subscribe, it really helps us out. So first up, value. With camera gear, it's always a balance to try to decide the value of a lens. The highest quality lenses can be very expensive. As business owners, we have to be able to justify the cost. Cheap lenses aren't great either because they can result in low image quality. It's all about finding a high enough quality lens at an affordable price. We used to shoot Canon and loved the 50mm f1.4 lens that was affordable and good quality. It struck that balance of a good lens at a justifiable price. When we switched to Sony, we were looking for something similar in the 50mm focal length, but or I should say Mark, kept reading about how crappy the cheap Sony 50-1.8 lens was. Now Sony does have a nice high quality 50-1.2 or 1.4, but they're very expensive and therefore hard to justify. They're also heavy, and if you've listened to any of Mark's gear reviews, we love lightweight and compact gear. In fact, that's one of the big selling points of switching from DSLR to mirrorless for us, so it makes sense to factor that into our lens choices as well. So instead we started using the 55mm f1.8, which strikes that value balance for us. I'll link the lens and a full review that Mark did below. Let's talk about the difference between 50 and 55mm. To me, the difference between these two focal lengths is more about the cost of a high quality mid-range lens, which is why I shoot the 55mm f1.8. Now, 55 is slightly more telephoto than 50, but most people probably couldn't tell the difference between these two focal lengths. Some people can't even tell the difference between 35 and 55, or 55 and 85, or 70 and 85. But yeah, there's technically a difference, and I'm sure it's a very big one to some people. I started to try to look into it before filming this video, just to make sure I wasn't misleading you. But then I decided I don't really care about such debates because they don't seem to make me a better photographer. Instead, let's talk about what's important about the 55mm focal length and how to shoot with it, since that's the title of my video and why you're actually here. So shooting with the 55mm lens. First off, shoot what you see. That's part of what makes this lens easy to shoot with. You don't have to imagine how the focal length will change the scene. You can capture it as you see it, which might sound boring at first, but that frees up some mental bandwidth to seek out intentional framing and composition. Now you can challenge and push yourself to master some techniques that will make you a better photographer. With framing, we're talking about the position of the camera. A classic example is the rule of thirds and making sure you place your subject in a pleasing place in the frame. Or sometimes I think about framing as what to include or exclude from my frame. Or even more simply, paying attention to things like not cutting off fingers in weird places or other body parts. Simple things like that get more intuitive over time, but are mistakes that beginners make because there's so much to focus on with photography, which is why shooting with this lens is so great. Then, thinking about composition means thinking about all the elements in the frame and how they're interacting with each other. That's like using leading lines to point to your subject, or patterns and foreground elements to help draw the viewer's eyes. Or just avoiding poor composition, like trees growing out of people's heads, or distracting elements that are interrupting the flow of the image. With the 55mm focal length, you can give yourself mental space to focus on making a good, clean, crisp, classic photograph. Sometimes we want to do something crazy or epic, but sometimes just getting a nice classic shot is more important, and it's approachable for the viewer. So let's talk about how I use my 55mm. As I was working on my outline for this video, I felt like I don't use the 55 that much, especially compared to the 35 or the 85. But when I went and looked in Lightroom, I realized I actually do. It's actually a great idea to check the focal lengths of your images in your portfolios. That way you know which lenses you favor, even if it's different than what you might think. And it's also good to make sure you have that focal length variety in your portfolio in order to show off your photography skills. So often I do shoot with the 35 and an 85, especially for much of a wedding day. But sometimes I shoot the 55 instead of the 35. Especially if I have more space in a getting ready room, because it allows me to get an intimate shot without getting so close in times that it might feel awkward. Or similarly during a ceremony, maybe I don't have enough space for the 85, but I need to get in closer than I can with my 35 to capture an intimate moment. Enter the 55. When it comes to portraits, it's a nice classic focal length that's fast and sharp when working in low light. Often we'll shoot portraits with a 16 to 35 and a 70 to 200, but sometimes the 70 to 200 is too telephoto for where I am. So the 55 is great for that medium focal length. There's also minimal distortion, so your subjects won't look misshapen. With wider lenses, you have to remember to think about your angles to your subject so that things don't get weird and distorted, but the 55 is much more flexible and forgiving. For landscapes and action shots, you get a sense of place wider than a more telephoto focal length without a giant landscape like you would with a wide focal length. You can get bokeh and subject isolation and a tiny bit of compression. Make sure you check out my bokeh video as well as the telephoto lens video for more on compression. Since this lens is so compact, it's easy to just throw it in your bag in case you need it. It won't weigh you down, but it might prove useful. While sometimes I don't think of the 55mm as an important lens, it's clearly a useful one. When a 35 is too wide and an 85 is too tight, the 55 saves the day. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.